On the morning of September 12, 1944, a German sergeant stepped off a train 6 miles north of Medford, Oregon, and stopped walking. He was 22 years old. His name was Joseph Weber, and for the past 16 months, ever since British soldiers had pulled him from a trench in the Tunisian desert, he had been waiting to die. He had waited on the transport ship out of Oran. He had waited in the holding camp in Virginia. He had waited every single morning for 84 days, expecting the door of his barracks to open and a firing squad to be standing outside. Instead, on that September morning in southern Oregon, he stepped off the train and saw green mountains rising against a blue sky, pine forests, a river cutting through valleys that looked exactly like the Black Forest where his father had taken him hiking as a boy. And standing under a pine tree, 20 feet from the barbed wire, an American guard was reading a newspaper. No rifle raised, no dogs, no shouting, just a man reading the paper. Joseph Weber stood on the platform outside Medford, Oregon, and could not understand what he was seeing. He would spend the next 19 months trying to understand it, and what he learned would eventually make him betray everything he had been taught to believe. The story you are about to hear is based on the documented experiences of German prisoners of war held at Camp White and other Oregon camps between 1944 and 1946, including the memoirs of Willie Gross, Heinz Richter, and Hans Kruger. The character of Joseph Weber is a composite drawn from those accounts and from War Department records. The events described all happened. This is how they happened to one representative man. The train slowed at 11:30 on the morning of September 12, 1944. Joseph Weber pressed his face to the glass of the Pullman car and watched Oregon come into view. He was 22 years old. He had left Stuttgart at 19. Between those two ages, he had crossed the Mediterranean in the belly of a troop ship, marched through the sand of Libya, dug trenches under Rommel's command, watched half his company die under British artillery, and surrendered outside Tunis on the 12th of May, 1943. He had not seen his mother in more than 3 years. He had not eaten a full meal in more than one. Now the train squealed to a stop at a small station 6 miles north of Medford, and Weber saw green mountains rising against a blue September sky, pine forests climbing toward distant peaks, a river cutting through open country. It looked impossibly like home. He stopped walking. The soldier behind him bumped into his back and cursed in German. His name was Werner Engel, 24 years old, Corporal, 15th Panzer Division, farm boy from outside Munich. He had transferred through 3 units before ending up in North Africa, Poland in 1939 with the 4th Infantry, France in 1940 with the 2nd Panzer, then transferred to the 15th Panzer when it deployed to Libya in the spring of 1941, and finally to Tunisia, where his tank ran out of fuel 2 days before the surrender. Engel looked past Weber and saw the mountains too. Neither man spoke. They had been told many things about America. They had been told the food would be poisoned. They had been told the Americans would work them to death in labor camps. They had been told the country was full of gangsters and cowards and moral collapse and race mixing. They had been told the American army had orders to shoot German prisoners the moment they were off the transports. They had been told nothing about mountains that looked like home. An American sergeant stepped up beside them and gestured with a clipboard. "Move along," he said in English. "Keep the line moving." Weber did not understand the words. He understood the gesture, started walking. 16 months earlier, in the desert outside Tunis, Weber had been certain he was going to die. The Africa Corps had been eating half rations for a year. The supply ships from Italy had been sunk one by British submarines and American aircraft. His unit had been drinking water rationed by the cup, sharing cigarettes cut into thirds, sleeping in shifts under a sun that could kill a man in 2 hours. When the order to surrender came, Weber had not felt relief. He had felt fear. The British and Americans had captured more than 250,000 Axis troops. In the final collapse, nobody knew what would happen to that many prisoners. Nobody had ever surrendered on that scale before. Weber walked out of his trench with his hands on his head and waited to be shot. Instead, a British corporal handed him a canteen of clean water. He drank until his stomach hurt. The British marched them to a holding area near the coast. They were fed. They were given medical treatment. They were loaded onto trucks and driven to the port of Oran in French Algeria. There, they waited for weeks while the Allies tried to figure out what to do with them. The answer came in the form of an American cargo ship. She was a Liberty ship, one of the mass-produced freighters that carried the American war effort across every ocean on Earth. She had delivered tanks and ammunition to North Africa. Now, she was going home to Norfolk, Virginia, and in her empty holds, she would carry nearly 600 German prisoners of war. Weber climbed down into the hold and prepared himself for 3 weeks of hell. 3 weeks in a metal box in the North Atlantic. 3 weeks of stale water, spoiled food, disease, madness. He had heard the stories about Soviet prison ships. He knew what men could do to prisoners nobody would ever count. He was wrong. The Americans fed them 3 times a day. Beef, bread, vegetables, coffee. More food than Weber had seen in a single meal since 1942. The cooks in the ship's galley were young sailors from Iowa and Nebraska, and they served the German prisoners the same rations they served the American crew. Weber ate. He ate until he could not stand up. He ate until his body, which had been surviving on hunger for 18 months, began to remember what fullness felt like. The other prisoners around him ate the same way. Some cried while they ate. Some prayed. Some vomited from the sudden richness, and then went back to the line for more. An old sergeant from Berlin sat on his bunk after the first meal and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "This is a trick. They will kill us after we get fat." Nobody argued with him, but nobody stopped eating. Now, 16 months later, Weber walked through the main gate of Camp White at 11:47 in the morning. He carried a duffel bag containing everything he owned, a change of underwear, a shaving kit, a photograph of his mother, Anna, 3 letters she had sent to him during his months in Virginia, all of them at least 4 months old by the time they reached his hands. The camp stretched across the flat scrub of the Agate Desert like a small American city. Weber would later learn the numbers. 1,300 wooden buildings. 40,000 American soldiers had trained here since 1942, learning to fight in terrain that resembled the France and Germany they would soon invade. Now, in late 1944, the Americans had turned part of the camp into a prisoner compound. 1,600 German soldiers occupied the northeastern edge. Weber and 83 other new arrivals were about to raise that number to nearly 1,700. A young corporal directed them toward their barracks. No shouting, no rifles pointed at their backs, just directions. The barracks were long wooden buildings with tar paper roofs. Inside, each bunk had a mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a pillow. Weber sat down on his assigned bunk and pressed his palm against the mattress. It did not move. He had been sleeping on sand for 1.5 years across Libya and Tunisia. He had been sleeping on a wooden shelf for 3 weeks in the belly of the Liberty ship. He had been sleeping on a canvas cot for 4 months in the processing camp in Virginia. Now he sat on a mattress in Oregon and could not make himself lie down. Engel took the bunk above him. He looked around at the barracks, at the mattresses, at the other prisoners quietly unpacking their few possessions, at the electric lights hanging from the ceiling, at the wood stove in the corner, cold now in September, but ready for winter. He said what everyone else was thinking. This cannot be real. Weber did not answer. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the guards escorted the new prisoners to the mess hall. Weber smelled the food before he saw it. real food, not the thin soup that had been standard in the final months of the Africa campaign, not the hard black bread that had crumbled to dust in a man's hands. Actual cooking, the smell of meat roasting and butter melting and coffee brewing. The prisoners formed a line at the serving counter. American cooks stood behind the counter with large pots and pans. They ladled food onto metal trays without looking at the men they were serving. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, a slice of white bread with a pat of butter, a cup of hot black coffee. Weber carried his tray to a long wooden table. He sat down. He did not eat. Around him, other German prisoners sat with their trays untouched. Nobody was talking. Nobody was moving. They were staring at their food the way starving men stare at a memory they cannot quite believe. Weber looked at the portion of meat on his tray. More meat than he had eaten in a single meal since the spring of 1942. He tried to count backwards. 2.5 years. He tried to remember the last time he had held a piece of roast beef this large in his own hands. He could not. Engels sat down across from him. They are trying to fatten us before they shoot us. Weber picked up his fork. If they are going to shoot me, he said, I will die with a full stomach. He put the first bite in his mouth. The meat was tender. The potatoes were hot. The bread was soft. He ate everything on his tray. When he finished, he looked up. Around him, the mess hall had come alive. Other prisoners were eating now. Some were shoveling food into their mouths, as if the meal might be taken away. Others were eating slowly, deliberately, as if trying to make each bite last. A few were crying without making any sound. A young private at the next table had his face in his hands, and his shoulders were shaking, and his tray sat in front of him untouched. And Weber understood without being told that the boy could not bring himself to eat, because eating meant accepting that the war had brought him to this place, and accepting that meant admitting that everything he had believed for the last 5 years had been a lie. Weber did not cry. He sat at the table and looked at his empty tray and tried to understand what was happening to him. He was a prisoner of the United States of America. He was in the state of Oregon, 6 miles north of a town called Medford. He had just eaten more meat in one meal than his mother had eaten in an entire month back in Stuttgart. And a friendly American sergeant with a clipboard would be by shortly to tell him what came next. That was the twist that no German propaganda film had ever prepared him for. The Americans were feeding him better than the German army had. The country he had been taught to hate was treating him with more dignity than his own country had shown its own soldiers in the final year of the war. Weber sat at the table in the mess hall at Camp White, 6 miles north of Medford, Oregon. On the afternoon of September the 12th, 1944, and he began to understand that the world he had been told existed did not exist. And the world that did exist was something no one back home would ever believe. That first afternoon, an American captain addressed the new prisoners in careful German. His name was Robert Hollister. He was 39 years old, from Ohio, an officer in the Provost Marshal General's office, assigned to command the POW compound at Camp White. He had studied German literature at Oberlin College in the 1920s. He spoke with a slight Bavarian accent because his professor had been from Munich. Hollister stood at the front of the mess hall and read from a printed sheet. Weber listened carefully. 6 days of work per week, pay of 80 cents per day, credited to a canteen account and to a trust fund payable at repatriation. Cigarettes, soap, writing paper, and magazines available for purchase at the camp store. Letters home would be delivered by the International Red Cross, free postage. Current mail delivery time to Germany, approximately 4 months. Newspapers could be subscribed to. The recommended local publication was the Oregonian. English classes and lectures on American history were offered in the evenings for any prisoner who wished to attend. A camp library contained more than 2,000 books, half of them in German. Sports equipment was available. A soccer field had been laid out on the northern edge of the compound. Prisoners would be treated according to the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention. Food rations were identical to those served to American soldiers. Medical care was identical. Any prisoner caught attempting escape would spend 14 days in solitary confinement. A second attempt earned 30 days. A third attempt meant transfer to a maximum security facility in Texas or Oklahoma. Hollister lowered his sheet of paper. "Are there questions?" Weber raised his hand. "Is this real?" Hollister looked at him for a long moment. The German prisoners in the room went very still. "This is Camp White," Hollister said. "You are prisoners of war of the United States of America. You will be treated as the Geneva Convention requires. You will work. You will be paid. You will be fed. When the war ends, you will go home." He paused. "That is real." Weber would spend the next 19 months learning the geography of Camp White and the country surrounding it. The camp itself covered nearly 77 square miles of flat, dry land at the base of the Cascade Mountains. The Army had chosen this site in early 1942 because the terrain resembled the training ground American infantrymen would eventually see in southern Europe. Rolling scrub, open plains, distant mountains. Perfect for artillery practice. Perfect for maneuvers. Perfect, as it turned out, for a prison camp, too. The compound where the German prisoners lived was fenced with double rows of barbed wire and watched by guard towers at each corner. Inside the fence, though, life was strangely open. Prisoners moved freely between the barracks and the mess hall and the library and the recreation yard. They played soccer in the afternoons. They gathered in small groups in the evenings to smoke and talk about home. On Sunday, a Catholic chaplain and a Lutheran chaplain, both American, held services in German for any prisoner who wished to attend. Beyond the fence, Oregon stretched out in every direction. To the west, the Rogue River Valley opened toward the Pacific Ocean. 90 miles away, Weber never saw that ocean during his time in Oregon. But he saw the valley many times, riding in the back of an army truck on his way to the orchards. Green fields, white farmhouses, cattle grazing on land that had never been touched by war, red barns standing whole and undamaged in a country where no bomb had ever fallen. To the east, the Cascade Mountains rose in dark ridges toward the sky. Snow-capped peaks, old-growth forests of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. The Rogue River itself came down out of those mountains, cutting a canyon through basalt cliffs that ice had carved 10,000 years ago. To the north, past Grants Pass and Roseburg, the highway led toward the Willamette Valley and the great agricultural belt of western Oregon. Hops fields, hazelnut orchards, cherry farms. 10,000 acres of green land that fed most of the American West Coast. 6 German prisoner camps operated across those valleys, from Camp Adair, north of Corvallis, to the branch camps at Nyssa and Pendleton and Vail. Weber never visited them, but he heard about them from prisoners who transferred in and out. The same story everywhere. Barbed wire on the outside, roast beef on the inside. American farmers who spoke German and paid in kindness. To the south, the highway crossed the California border at Ashland and climbed toward the town of Eureka, and beyond that, to the great white cathedral of Mount Shasta. Weber had never seen a country like this. Germany was a small country, dense with cities and railways and factories. Every kilometer of German soil had been fought over and worked and rebuilt for 1,000 years. There was nowhere in Germany where a man could stand and see nothing but mountains and forest and empty valley to the horizon. Oregon was vast. Oregon was empty. Oregon was, in some way, Weber could not quite name, an entire country that had escaped history. On his second morning at Camp White, Weber was assigned to a work detail. At 7:30 in the morning, guards loaded 36 prisoners onto the back of a 2.5-ton truck. The truck drove south through the Rogue Valley on Highway 99, past small farms and orchards and roadside stands selling apples and cider. Weber sat on the wooden bench in the back of the truck and watched Oregon roll past him. No bomb craters, no burned buildings, no refugees walking beside the road with everything they owned tied to their backs. Just farms, just fences, just cattle and pear trees and quiet country roads. The truck turned off the highway and pulled up in front of a wooden farmhouse with a wide front porch. A man was waiting for them beside a rusting Ford pickup. His name was Raymond Fisher. He was 54 years old, second-generation German-American. His father had emigrated from Baden in 1878, worked his way west, and homesteaded 80 acres of Rogue Valley bottomland in 1889. Raymond had grown up on that land, taken it over from his father in 1919, and expanded it to 340 acres of pear and apple orchards over the following 2 decades. His wife Helene had been born in Bavaria and had crossed the Atlantic alone as a young woman to marry him in 912. They had one son who was fighting somewhere in the Pacific with the United States Marine Corps. Fisher spoke German better than he spoke English. He walked out to meet the prisoners and shook the guard's hand, and then turned to the men climbing down from the truck. "Willkommen in Oregon," he said. "Welcome to Oregon." Weber felt something shift inside his chest. The first words spoken to him in his own language by a free man in North America. Fisher walked the prisoners through the pear orchard and explained the work. "Pick carefully. Do not bruise the fruit. Fill the wooden boxes. Stack them by the road. A good worker fills 36 boxes in a day. Meet that quota and you can rest. Do better, and I will remember it." He demonstrated how to twist a pear from the branch without damaging the stem. He showed them how to judge ripeness and by color and firmness. Then he walked back to his pickup, climbed in, and drove away. One American guard remained. He sat under a pear tree with a rifle across his knees and opened up a copy of the Medford Mail Tribune. Weber turned to Engel. "Where are the other guards?" Engel shrugged. They began to pick pears. At noon, Fisher returned with a basket of sandwiches and a jug of cold water. He passed a sandwich to each prisoner. Ham and cheese, wrapped in waxed paper. He filled tin cups with water from the jug and passed those out, too. Then he sat down on the tailgate of his pickup and watched the prisoners eat. Weber ate his sandwich slowly and tried to remember the last time he had eaten a meal outdoors in the middle of a workday, in peace, with a full stomach and no gunfire in the distance. Could not remember. He looked over at the guard, who was now eating a sandwich of his own under the pear tree. He looked back at Fisher. "Why is there only one guard?" Fisher chewed his sandwich thoughtfully. "Where would you go?" Weber did not answer. Fisher wiped his mouth with a handkerchief and gestured at the country around them. "Canada is 800 miles north. You would have to cross the Cascades on foot in September. By November, there is snow in the passes. By December, they are closed." He pointed south. "Mexico is 1,200 miles that way. Through California, across the Mojave Desert. You have no water, no maps, no money." He gestured at the men in the field. "You have no civilian clothes. Every man in this valley knows German prisoners work on these orchards. You walk into Medford in that uniform, and the barber calls the sheriff before you can order a haircut. You walk down Highway 99, and the first truck driver who passes you radios ahead." Fisher took another bite of his sandwich. "The mountains hold you here. The desert holds you here. The ocean holds you here. And the people hold you here, most of all. Because most of them speak English and you do not, and every one of them knows exactly what a man in your uniform looks like." He swallowed. "Better, you pick pears. Earn your money. Eat your food. Go back to camp at the end of the day. The war ends. You go home." Engel spoke from beside Weber. "And what if we do not want to go home?" Fisher looked at him carefully. He looked at him for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that Weber would remember for the rest of his life, "Then you come back to Oregon after the war, and I will give you a job." He said it the way a man says something he has thought about carefully. He said it the way a man says something he means. Weber stood in the pear orchard 6 miles south of Medford, Oregon, on the afternoon of September the 13th, 1944, and he understood something that would take him 9 more years to act on. He was not in a prison. He was in a country. And the country was holding him with something stronger than barbed wire. Country was holding him with itself. The work routine at Camp White was 6 days a week. Wake at 5:30, roll call at 6, breakfast at 6:15. Trucks pulled out of the compound at 7 and returned at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, depending on the season and the crop. Dinner at 6. Free time from 7 until lights out at 9. English classes were held 3 evenings a week in the recreation hall. Weber attended every class. The teacher was an American lieutenant named Michael Karsten. He was 28 years old. Born in Milwaukee to a family of German descent, and he had studied philology at the University of Berlin during the year 1937. He remembered a Germany that no longer existed. He remembered Berlin before the war, the cafes on Friedrichstrasse, the concerts at the Philharmonic, the smell of coal smoke on winter mornings. He spoke German the way an educated Berliner spoke it, with careful vowels and precise syntax. He was patient with the prisoners. He taught them practical phrases first. I would like to buy bread. Where is the post office? Thank you for your help. How much does this cost? Then he moved on to newspaper English because he wanted the prisoners to be able to read what was happening in the world outside their compound. By the end of Weber's first month at Camp White, Weber could read the headlines of the Oregonian. By the end of the second month, he could read the articles. He read about the American advance across France. He read about the Soviet advance across Poland. He read about the systematic bombing of German cities: Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt, Stuttgart. His mother lived in Stuttgart. Weber had not received a letter from her since arriving at Camp White. He wrote to her every week, short, careful letters that would be read by German censors before they reached her hands. He told her he was safe. He told her he was working on farms in Oregon. He told her the Americans were treating him according to the Geneva Convention. He did not tell her about the roast beef. He did not tell her about the mattress. He did not tell her about the apple pie fisher's wife had sent to the barracks after their first day in the orchard. He did not know how to say those things in a letter that had to pass through the hands of men who might arrest her for reading them. In late November of 1944, Raymond Fisher put in a request through the War Manpower Commission for a small crew of prisoners to help him build a concrete garage on his property. The commission approved the request within a week. Fisher paid the government the standard rate for prisoner labor, which was considerably higher than the 80 cents per day that would be credited to the prisoners' accounts. The difference went to the Army to offset the cost of running the camp. Fisher did not complain about the price. Skilled labor was almost impossible to find in the Rogue Valley in the winter of 1944. Every able-bodied American man was either overseas or working in a war factory in Portland or Seattle. If Fisher wanted a garage built, prisoners were his only option. Weber was one of the 4 men Fisher requested by name. They arrived at his farm on a Monday morning in the first week of December. The weather was cold and wet, the kind of Oregon winter rain that fell straight down without wind and soaked a man through to the bone within an hour. Fisher met them at the truck with rubber boots and heavy canvas coats. He handed the coats around. These are old. From my son. You can keep them. Weber pulled on the coat and felt the weight of it. Wool lining, waterproof canvas, thick enough to keep out the November wind. In 3 years of war, he had never owned a coat this good. The 4 prisoners spent the next 3 weeks building the garage. Fisher worked alongside them. He was 54 years old. He was strong. He mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow with his sleeves rolled up in the December rain, and he showed the prisoners how to lay a foundation that would not shift when the winter frost came. He showed them how to build wooden forms and pour concrete into them. He showed them how to set steel reinforcement bar. He showed them how to finish a concrete floor smooth enough to sweep clean. Weber had never worked construction before the war. Before the war, he had been a printer, an apprentice in his father's shop on the Königstrasse in Stuttgart. His hands knew type and ink and press rollers. They did not know concrete. Fischer taught him. At the end of each day, Fischer's wife, Helene, brought coffee and bread out to the work site. Sometimes she brought a pot of soup. Once she brought a whole apple pie, still warm from the oven, and the prisoners ate it, standing in the cold rain with the mountains disappearing into the clouds behind them. On the second Friday of the job, Helene invited the 4 prisoners into her kitchen. She invited the guard, too. That was how it was done. The guard sat at the table with the prisoners and drank coffee and ate her bread and cheese and did not report the visit to his commanding officer. Everyone at Camp White knew that the fraternization rules were officially strict and unofficially ignored. Farmers fed their prisoners in their kitchens. Prisoners taught farmers' children German. Guards drank coffee with their charges on cold winter afternoons and looked the other way when a prisoner slipped a piece of pie into his jacket to take back to the barracks. Helene Fischer was 61 years old, born in Bavaria in 1883. She had crossed the Atlantic alone at the age of 28 to marry Raymond, whom she had met through a family connection in Munich. She had lived on this Oregon farm for 32 years. She had raised one son who was now fighting the Japanese somewhere in the Pacific. She had not been back to Germany since 1912. She served coffee and asked the prisoners questions in German. Where were they from? Did they have families? What did they do before the war? Weber told her about Stuttgart, about his father Karl, a master printer with his own small shop, about his mother Anna, who kept the books and raised the children, about his younger sister, Erica, 16 years old now, who had wanted to be a teacher before the war closed the university to women, about being drafted in 1941 at the age of 19, about training for 2 months and shipping to Africa without ever seeing combat in Europe, about Tunis and the surrender and the Liberty ship and the long voyage to America. Helene listened. She refilled his coffee cup twice. When Weber finished talking, she wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him and said quietly, "Your mother must be very worried." Weber did not answer. He could not answer. Helene reached across the table and put her hand on his wrist. She was old enough to be his mother. She had a son of her own, somewhere in the Pacific, who might already be dead. She held Weber's wrist for perhaps 5 seconds, and then she let go and stood up and went to check the bread in the oven. When the prisoners left the kitchen that afternoon to go back to work, Helene pressed a bundle of cloth napkins into Weber's hands. "Keep them," she said. "I have plenty." Weber walked back out into the December rain with the napkins hidden inside his coat. He did not know how to tell anyone what had just happened to him. He was a prisoner of war of the United States of America. He was working on a farm owned by a German American in the Rogue Valley of Oregon, and a woman his mother's age had just sat him down in her kitchen and served him coffee and asked him about his family and touched his wrist with sympathy. The garage took 3 weeks to complete. When it was finished, Fischer walked through it with Weber and inspected the concrete work and nodded with satisfaction. "This will last 50 years. He said it the way a man makes a promise." That evening, Weber took his weekly canteen scrip from the camp accountant and walked over to the camp store. His account had been growing since his arrival. 80 cents for every day worked, minus small purchases of soap and cigarettes and writing paper. He had almost $15 in scrip credit. He spent 30 cents on 3 chocolate bars. He spent 15 cents on a magazine about American automobiles. He carried the magazine back to the barracks and sat on his bunk and opened it under the electric light. The pages were full of photographs: Ford, Chevrolet, Chrysler, Buick, Cadillac, Pontiac, Dodge, Studebaker, Nash, Packard, Hudson, Weber counted the manufacturers on his fingers and ran out of fingers. The magazine showed factories in Detroit and Cleveland and Flint and South Bend. Factories the size of small cities. Factories with assembly lines a mile long. Factories that had been converted from car production to tank production in 1942 and would be converted back after the war. He read the production numbers. In 1941, the last year before American conversion to war production, the United States had built 4 million passenger cars. 4 million in 1 year. Weber sat on his bunk in the barracks at Camp White and stared at that number and tried to fit it into his head. He thought about the German army in Tunisia in the spring of 1943. He thought about the fuel shortage that had immobilized his division. He thought about the ammunition that had run out during the final battles. He thought about the tanks that had been abandoned intact because there was no gasoline to move them. He thought about the moment his commanding officer had ordered the surrender because continuing to fight would accomplish nothing except getting everyone killed. He looked at the photographs in the magazine. Assembly lines a mile long. 4 million cars in a year. Weber understood for the first time why Germany had lost the war in Africa. Not because of tactics, not because of leadership, not because of the will to fight, because of factories, because of steel, because of oil, because a country that could build 4 million cars in a year could build any number of tanks it wanted. He closed the magazine. He lay back on his mattress and stared at the ceiling of the barracks. Somewhere in Germany, his father was still working in a print shop, or maybe in a munitions factory, if the print shop had been bombed. Somewhere in Germany, his mother was still cooking dinner with whatever rations she could obtain. Somewhere in Germany, his sister was still trying to finish her schooling in a country that was collapsing around her. Weber closed his eyes and understood that Germany was going to lose the war. Not maybe, not possibly, certainly. The only question was how much would be left when the losing was done. In the second week of January 1945, 3 trucks pulled into Camp White, carrying 200 new prisoners. These men had been captured in the Ardennes in December, during the German counter-offensive that the Americans were already calling the Battle of the Bulge. They were younger than the Afrika Korps prisoners. Many of them were teenagers, and they included for the first time at Camp White a substantial contingent of Waffen-SS. Weber watched them unload from the trucks. They stepped down onto the muddy ground of the compound with their uniforms still marked by the mud of the Ardennes forest. And they looked around at the wooden barracks and the mess hall and the guard towers, and Weber could see the confusion on their faces. They had been told they would be killed. They had been told the American camps were extermination camps. They had been told that the Americans and the British were secretly working with the Bolsheviks to exterminate the German race. They had been told this by their officers. They had been told this by their political commissars. They had been told this by the last German-language propaganda broadcasts they had heard before capture. And now they were standing in an Oregon prison compound where the barracks had heating, and the food was better than what they had been eating on the front line. And they did not know how to fit that into what they had been told. Some of them refused to eat. Some of them refused to work. One of them, a 19-year-old private, threw his dinner tray against the wall of the mess hall on the second night and shouted that accepting American food was treason. 3 guards escorted him out. The next morning, he was in the potato fields with everyone else, and by nightfall, he was eating in the mess hall, along with the rest of the new prisoners. And by the end of the week, he had stopped talking about treason altogether. But there was a harder core inside the new arrivals. Sergeant Klaus Reinhardt was 22 years old, Waffen-SS, Panzer Division. He had joined the Hitler Youth at 10 and the SS at 17. He had fought in the East, in the West, and now in the Ardennes. He believed everything he had ever been told about the Reich and everything he had ever been told about its enemies. And he intended to continue believing those things, regardless of what he saw around him. Reinhardt gathered around him a small circle of ideologically reliable men, perhaps a dozen, mostly other Waffen-SS, a few from panzer units. He set himself up as the unofficial commander of the new arrivals, and he set about identifying which of the older prisoners at Camp White had gone soft. He identified Corporal Otto Brandt within the first week. Brandt was 26 years old, Wehrmacht infantry, captured in Italy in September of 1944. He had been at Camp White for 4 months. He had learned English quickly. He attended Lieutenant Karsten's classes every night. He had been overheard telling another prisoner that he did not intend to go back to Germany after the war if he could find any way to stay in America. That was enough for Reinhardt. On the night of February 8th, 1945, Reinhardt and 4 of his men walked into the barracks where Brandt slept. They pulled him out of his bunk. They beat him for approximately 6 minutes. They broke his nose, 3 of his ribs, and the small bone on the outside of his left eye socket. They knocked out 2 of his teeth. They stopped when the barrack sergeant came running with 2 American guards behind him. Reinhardt and his men were pulled off Brandt and thrown into solitary confinement. Brandt was carried to the camp infirmary. Weber watched all of this from his bunk 3 rows away. He did not move. He did not speak. He lay in his bed with his eyes open and listened to the sound of a man being beaten, and he did not intervene. He understood exactly why he did not intervene. He was on Reinhardt's list, too. Every man in the barracks who had learned English, every man who had attended Karsten's classes, every man who had eaten in an American farmer's kitchen, every man who had begun to think about a life after the war that did not necessarily involve returning to Germany, every one of those men was on Reinhardt's list. And every one of those men lay in his bunk that night and listened to Otto Brandt being beaten and did not move. The next morning, Captain Hollister ordered Reinhardt and his men transferred to a separate compound at the far end of the camp. Then he came into Weber's barracks and stood in the doorway and looked at the men. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, in German, "You had a choice last night. You made it." He turned and walked out. Weber lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling and understood that Hollister was right. He had made a choice. He had chosen his own safety over Otto Brandt's ribs. He had chosen the mattress and the coffee and the 80 cents a day over the man 3 bunks away who had been trying, in his own quiet way, to imagine an American life for himself. Weber had chosen wrong. He would remember it for the rest of his life. Through the spring of 1945, the Americans expanded the program they carefully avoided calling re-education. They called it information. Lieutenant Karsten led most of the sessions. He showed the prisoners films about American history, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the framing of the Constitution. He explained how the American government was structured. 3 branches: executive, legislative, judicial, checks and balances. Elections every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, depending on the office. Political parties that competed openly for power. Newspapers that criticized the president without being shut down. The prisoners did not believe him. They thought it was propaganda. Karsten brought in American newspapers with different political opinions. He showed the prisoners editorials attacking President Roosevelt from the right and from the left. He showed them cartoons mocking the president. He showed them letters to the editor from citizens who disagreed with the government's war policy. The prisoners thought the newspapers were fabricated. Karsten brought in local citizens from Medford, farmers, storekeepers, a retired schoolteacher, a doctor. He asked them to sit at the front of the classroom and answer questions about how they had voted in the 1944 election and what they thought about various government policies. The citizens argued with each other. They disagreed openly in front of the German prisoners about their own leaders and their own laws. Nothing happened to any of them. Weber sat in the back of the classroom and watched an old woman from Medford stand up and say, without lowering her voice, that in her opinion, Franklin Roosevelt was a socialist and had ruined the country. Then he watched a younger man in a mechanic's overalls stand up and disagree with her and say Roosevelt was the greatest president since Lincoln. And he watched the two of them argue with each other for 5 minutes and then shake hands and leave the classroom together as if nothing had happened. In Germany, criticizing the Führer in public meant a knock at the door in the middle of the night. In Oregon, an old woman could call the president a socialist in front of 30 enemy soldiers and go home afterward and cook her supper and sleep in her own bed. Weber did not know what to do with this information. He wrote it down in a notebook he had bought at the canteen. He wrote it in German. He wrote it carefully. He knew he would never show it to anyone. He was writing it for himself. On the afternoon of May 8th, 1945, the camp loudspeakers announced that Germany had capitulated. The war in Europe was over. Adolf Hitler was dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker. All German forces had laid down their arms. Camp commander ordered all prisoners assembled in the main yard. He read the announcement in English. Lieutenant Karsten translated it into German. The German prisoners stood in the yard in silence. Nobody wept. Nobody protested. Nobody collapsed. Captain Hollister, watching from the edge of the yard, had expected suicides in the days following the announcement. There had been suicides at other camps. Prisoners who could not accept the defeat of their country had hanged themselves in their barracks, or drowned themselves in the camp pond, or opened their wrists with sharpened spoons. At Camp White, there were no suicides. There was only silence. There was only, on the evening of May 9th, an escape attempt. 2 prisoners, both former Waffen-SS, both members of Reinhardt's inner circle, before Reinhardt's transfer, slipped out through a gap they had cut in the wire at the north end of the compound. They walked 6 miles overland toward the Medford Railroad Station, apparently intending to board a freight train and travel east to the German-speaking communities in North Dakota or Minnesota, where they believed they could disappear into the general population. They were caught within 6 hours. An off-duty American railroad worker saw 2 men in German uniforms crouched behind a stack of lumber at the freight yard and called the Medford police. The police called the army. A patrol picked up both prisoners without incident. They were returned to Camp White before sunrise and sentenced to 14 days in solitary confinement. When they emerged from solitary 2 weeks later, they were quiet. The war was over. There was nowhere left to go. Weber's letters from home began to arrive in the second week of August, 1945, 3 months after the German surrender. They came in bundles, forwarded through the International Red Cross, from collection points in liberated Europe. Some of them had been written in 1944 and had spent nearly a year in transit. Some had been written in April of 1945 and had reached Camp White within 4 months. Some had been written by people who were now dead. Weber received 3 letters on the same day. He carried them back to the barracks and sat on his bunk and read them in the order they had been written. The first was from his mother, Anna, dated February 3rd, 1945. She wrote that his sister Erica had been killed in an air raid on the night of January 28th, 1945. Erica had been 16 years old. She had been sheltering in the basement of a neighbor's house when the building took a direct hit from a British bomb. Her body had been recovered the following morning. She had been buried in the Stuttgart-Prague-Friedhof Cemetery on January 31st. Anna wrote that there had been very few people at the funeral because most of their friends had already left the city or were dead themselves. The second letter was from his mother, dated March 22nd, 1945. She wrote that his father Carl had been killed on March 15th, 1945. When the munitions factory, where he had been working since the destruction of his print shop the previous November, had been bombed by American aircraft. Carl had been 58 years old. He had been assembling artillery fuses on a production line staffed almost entirely by old men and boys. Anna had not been able to recover his body. It was assumed to be somewhere in the rubble of the factory building. There would be no funeral. The third letter was from his mother, dated May 20th, 1945. She wrote that the war was over. She wrote that French soldiers had entered Stuttgart on April 22nd without a fight because the German garrison had already surrendered. She wrote that American occupation forces had arrived shortly after to establish civil administration. She wrote that she was alive and that she was living in 3 rooms of a partially collapsed apartment building on the Kriegsbergstrasse, and that the occupation authorities were distributing food rations, and that she hoped he was safe wherever he was. She wrote that she loved him. She wrote that she prayed for him every night. She wrote that she hoped he was eating well. Weber sat on his bunk in the barracks at Camp White with the 3 letters in his hand, and he understood that his sister was dead, and his father was dead, and his mother was alive alone in 3 rooms of a broken building in Stuttgart. He had been eating apple pie. He had been picking pears. He had been building a concrete garage that would last 50 years. He had been sleeping on a mattress with 2 wool blankets and a pillow. His sister had died in a basement in Stuttgart. His father had died in a munitions factory in Stuttgart. His mother was alone in 3 rooms. Weber did not cry. He folded the letters carefully and put them in the wooden box under his bunk where he kept his few possessions. He lay back on the mattress and closed his eyes and did not cry because he did not know what crying would accomplish. He was in Oregon. His family was in Germany. There was nothing he could do about any of it. That night in the barracks, Engels sat on his bunk and stared at the wall for a long time. Then he spoke. "We lost." Weber nodded everything. "Yes." Engel was quiet for a long time. "My father died in Poland in 1940, he said finally. "My brother died in Russia in 1943. For nothing." Weber did not know what to say. Engel spoke again. "I do not know if I want to go back." Weber looked over at him. "Where would you go?" "Here," Engels said. "Work for Fischer. Start a new life." "Germany is finished." Weber understood him. He had been thinking similar thoughts for months. But he knew what Engel did not yet know. American immigration law did not permit enemy soldiers to remain in the country after their release. All prisoners would be repatriated to Germany. All prisoners would be sent back to help rebuild the country they had helped destroy. Whether they wanted to go back was not a question the American government considered relevant. Weber lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling and did not answer Engels' question because there was no answer that made any difference. He would be sent back. They all would. The only question was when. Through the summer and fall of 1945, the prisoners of Camp White continued to work. American servicemen were still being demobilized from the Pacific Theater. The war with Japan had ended in August, but millions of American soldiers were still overseas, and the American economy had not yet reconverted to peacetime production. Farm labor in the Rogue Valley remained scarce. So Weber and Engel and the rest of the men at Camp White picked pears through September, apples through October, potatoes through November. Weber worked on Fischer's farm most days. He had become one of the best pickers in the camp. Fischer requested him by name for every job. In the evenings, Weber continued to attend Lieutenant Karsten's English classes. By the end of 1945, he could speak conversational English. He could not pass for an American, but he could hold a conversation with a farmer or a shopkeeper without needing a translator. He read The Oregonian every day. He read American paperback novels that he bought at the camp canteen for a nickel apiece. Steinbeck, Hemingway, Willa Cather. He thought about staying. He knew he could not. The first prisoners at Camp White received their repatriation orders in December of 1945. Small groups, 100 men at a time. loaded onto trains and shipped east to New York or west to Seattle, then onto troop transports that would carry them back to Europe. Weber received his orders on the morning of April 3rd, 1946. He was to report to the main gate at 6 o'clock in the morning on April 8th with all his possessions. He would be transported by rail to the port of Seattle. There, he would board an American troop transport bound for Liverpool, England. In England, he would be temporarily reassigned as labor to help clear the bomb damage in the city of Coventry. After approximately 4 months, he would be released to the American occupation authorities in Germany and returned to his hometown of Stuttgart. He read the orders twice. He carried them back to the barracks and packed his few possessions into the same duffel bag he had carried into the camp 19 months earlier. The magazine about American automobiles. The cloth napkins from Helene Fisher's kitchen. The 3 letters from his mother, dated February, March, and May of 1945. The notebook in which he had written, in careful German, everything he had learned in Karsten's classroom about the American system of government. The photograph of his mother, folded and worn from being carried in his breast pocket for 5 years. That was everything he owned. On the afternoon of April 7th, 1946, the day before Weber's repatriation, Raymond Fisher drove to Camp White and asked to see him. The guards allowed it. They met in a visitor area with wire mesh between the tables. Weber sat on one side. Fisher sat on the other. They looked at each other through the wire. Fisher was 60 years old now. His hair had gone gray during the war. His son had come home from the Pacific in December, wounded but alive, and was now working on the farm again. Fisher looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was still carrying it. He spoke first. "I want you to come back." Weber did not answer. "After you are released from Germany, after things settle down, I want you to come back to Oregon and work for me. I will sponsor your immigration. I have a lawyer in Portland who handles these things." He says it is possible now for former prisoners who worked on farms. It will take time, 2 years, maybe 3, but it is possible. Weber looked at Fisher through the wire. He thought about Stuttgart, about the 3 rooms his mother lived in, about the print shop that was gone, about his father buried somewhere under a factory floor, about his sister buried in the Prague-Friedhof Cemetery, about the country he was going back to, which was no longer a country at all, but only a large open wound in the middle of Europe. He thought about Oregon. "I will think about it," he said. Fisher nodded. "I have something for you. I could not give it to you directly. Camp rules. Prisoners cannot receive money from civilians." Weber waited. "I made a payment through the War Department. It has been added to your trust fund. You will receive it when you sign out tomorrow morning. $200. Weber closed his eyes. $200 was more money than his father had earned in 6 months as a master printer before the war. $200 in post-war Germany would be a fortune. "I cannot accept it," he said. Fisher's face did not change. "You already have. It is in the account. I cannot take it back. You worked for me for a year and a half. You built things with your hands that will outlive both of us. You earned it. Take it home to your mother." Weber opened his eyes. "Danke." Fisher nodded once. "Come back when you can. The job will be waiting." He stood up. He put his hat on. He walked out of the visitor area. Weber sat at the table with the wire between him and the space where Fisher had been, and he did not stand up for a long time. The next morning at the accounting office, Weber signed for his trust fund payout, $247. $200 from Fisher, $47 from his own accumulated wages at 80 cents a day for 6 days a week for 19 months of work. The camp accountant counted the money out in $20 bills. Weber put the money into an envelope, and he put the envelope into the inside pocket of Raymond Fisher's son's canvas coat, and he walked out through the main gate of Camp White for the last time. The train ride to Seattle took 2 days. The troop transport sailed from Seattle on April 12th, 1946. 946, with 1,500 German prisoners on board and a skeleton crew of American merchant marine sailors. The voyage to Liverpool took 28 days. Weber spent it on deck when the weather allowed, watching the water, thinking about his mother. At Liverpool, the German prisoners were transferred to British custody and shipped by rail to a series of work camps around the city of Coventry. Weber spent 3 months clearing rubble from the streets of a city that had been destroyed by German bombs on the night of November 14th, 1940. The Coventry Cathedral was a burned shell. The medieval city center had been erased. Weber worked 12 hours a day, pulling brick and stone and twisted iron out of collapsed buildings. And every night he slept in a Quonset hut with 50 other German prisoners. And every day he watched British civilians walk past the work sites and stare at him with an expression he had no name for. They did not spit at him. They did not curse him. They just looked at him. They knew what his uniform meant. They knew what German bombers had done to their city. They looked at him and they walked on without speaking. And Weber understood that this was worse, in some way, than any spitting would have been. In August of 1946, the British released him to the American occupation zone. He took a train from Calais to Stuttgart. He arrived at the main railway station on the afternoon of August 19th, 1946. He walked out of the station and into a city he did not recognize. The Kriegsbergstrasse had been half destroyed by bombing. Weber walked past the collapsed buildings and the piled rubble and the temporary shelters made of salvage wood and canvas, and he found the address his mother had written in her last letter. The building was standing. Barely. Half of it had come down in an air raid in the winter of 1945. The remaining half was propped up with wooden beams and inhabited by families who had nowhere else to go. Weber climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door of what had once been his family's apartment. An old woman opened the door. She was not his mother. She was a refugee from East Prussia, she explained. She and her 3 grandchildren had been given the apartment in June, after the previous occupant had died. The previous occupant, Anna Weber. She had lung sickness, tuberculosis. She died on June the 18th. Weber stood in the doorway. The old woman looked at him more carefully. You are the son. Yes, she waited for you. She talked about you every day. She was sure you were coming home. I am very sorry. The old woman offered him coffee, which he declined. She offered him a place to sleep for the night, which he also declined. He turned and walked back down the stairs and out into the ruined street and did not know where he was going. His father was dead. His sister was dead. His mother was dead. He had come home to a city that had killed his family, and he had come home 2 months too late. He walked for a long time. He ended the afternoon at the Pragerfriedhof Cemetery, standing at his sister Erika's grave. There was no marker for his father, whose body had never been recovered. There was already a marker for his mother, put up by the neighbors, dated June 18th, 1946. Weber stood at the 2 graves and reached into his coat pocket and touched the envelope containing 247 American dollars. The money that was supposed to keep his mother alive, the money that had arrived 2 months too late. Weber found work within a week. A small printing company on the Neckarstrasse was trying to restart operations. The owner, an old man named Wilhelm Braun, had known Karl Weber before the war. He remembered Joseph as a boy in his father's shop. He hired Weber immediately as a pressman. The pay was minimal. Occupation currency and food rations. Enough to survive. Weber lived in a boarding house in the Bad Cannstatt district. He worked 6 days a week. On Sundays, he walked in the hills above the Neckar Valley and thought about Oregon. In the spring of 1947, at a church social organized by the occupation authorities, he met a woman named Marta Krebs. She was 26 years old. She had trained as a nurse before the war and had spent 4 years working in a hospital that had been bombed twice and rebuilt twice. Her fiancé had been killed at Stalingrad in the winter of 1943. She lived with her mother in 2 rooms of a house that had been divided into 6 apartments after the war. They married in November of 1947. Their first daughter, Ilse, was born in August of 1949. Their second daughter, Ursula, was born in October of 1951. By 1948, Weber had become the manager of Wilhelm Braun's printing company. Braun had died the previous winter and had left the business to Weber in his will, with the modest condition that Weber and continue to employ Braun's widow at a small monthly salary. The company was small but stable. Weber and Marta and the 2 girls lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Feuerbach district. They had enough to eat. They had heat in the winter. They had a life. Weber attended political meetings organized by the American occupation authorities. He listened to lectures about the new German Constitution, about the democratic government being established in the American, British, and French zones, about the separation of powers and the free press and the right to vote. The lectures sounded familiar. He had heard them before in a wooden classroom at Camp White from a lieutenant named Michael Karsten, who had spoken German with a Berlin accent. The letter from Raymond Fisher arrived in April of 1952. It had been forwarded through the Red Cross and through 3 different addresses before finally reaching Weber's apartment in Feuerbach. Fisher wrote in German. The letter was short. The job offer still stands. If you want to come to Oregon, I will sponsor your immigration. My lawyer says it is possible now for former prisoners who worked on farms during the war. Bring your family. Start a new life here. That was all. Weber read the letter 3 times. He showed it to Marta. She read it. She looked at him. What do you want to do? He did not know. Germany was better now. The economy was recovering. His printing business was stable. They had a life here. A small life, but a real one. But he thought about Oregon. He thought about the mountains and the pine forests and the wide open sky. He thought about the concrete garage that would last 50 years. He thought about Fisher sitting under a pear tree and eating a sandwich and saying, without any drama, that the country was holding Weber with itself. He thought about the country that had treated him better as an enemy than his own country had treated him as a citizen. Go visit, Marta said. See if it is what you remember. If it is, we will decide together. Weber traveled to Oregon in the summer of 1953. Fisher met him at the Portland airport, drove him south through the Willamette Valley, past Utah, over the Umpqua Highlands, and down into the Rogue Valley. Weber looked out the window of Fisher's Buick and saw the same country he had seen from the back of an army truck in 1944. Nothing had changed. The mountains were the same green ridges. The valleys were the same open farmland. The Rogue River still cut through the same basalt canyons. Fisher's farm had grown. The concrete garage Weber had helped build in December of 1944 was still standing, exactly as Fisher had predicted. Solid, functional, 9 years old and looking like it would last another 90. Weber spent 2 weeks on the farm. He worked in the orchards. He ate dinner with Fisher and Helene every night. He slept in the small guest cottage behind the main house. He walked into Medford one afternoon and bought coffee at a diner and paid the check himself and walked back to the farm without any American guard telling him where he could go. The freedom was strange. He had lived in Germany for 7 years after the war. He had grown used to a normal life, but he had never quite recovered from the police state he had grown up in, and he had never quite trusted the new West German democracy either, because he had watched a democracy collapse into dictatorship once and he knew it could happen again. Oregon felt different. Oregon felt like a place where nothing could ever collapse because there was too much room and too much sky and too much distance between the people and their government for any tyrant to reach them. Before Weber left to return to Germany, Fisher made his final offer. Come back. Bring your family. Work for me for 2 years. After that, I will sell you 20 acres of orchard land at a fair price. You build your own business. You become an American citizen. You raise your daughters here. Weber flew back to Stuttgart in September of 1953. He and Marta talked for 4 nights. They made their decision. The Weber family emigrated to Oregon February of 1954. Weber sold the printing company to a competitor for enough money to pay their passage and set them up in America. Fisher met them at the Portland airport and drove them south to the small house on his property where they would live. Ilse was 5 years old. Ursula was 3. They spoke no English. Within 6 months, they spoke English better than their parents. Within a year, they sounded like American children. Weber worked for Fisher for 3 years, not 2. He wanted to save more before buying his own land. In 1957, he purchased 30 acres of pear orchard 6 miles east of Fisher's farm. He built a small house. He planted additional trees. He established his own business growing and selling fruit under his own name. His daughters grew up American. They attended American schools. They pledged allegiance to the American flag every morning of every school day. They married American men in their 20s and had American children of their own. On the morning of September 27th, 1961, Joseph Weber stood in the federal courthouse in Medford, Oregon, and swore allegiance to the United States of America. He was 39 years old. The judge who administered the oath was Harold Meeks, 63 years old, a veteran of the 79th Infantry Division of the United States Army. Meeks had landed at Utah Beach on June 14, 1944, and had fought his way across France with his division and had crossed the Rhine near Rheinberg in March of 1945 as part of the Ninth Army's assault and had accepted the surrender of a German battalion in the Ruhr Pocket in April of that same year. Meeks had been shot twice. He had been decorated 3 times. He had come home to Oregon in 1946 and gone to law school on the GI Bill. Now, in the federal courthouse in Medford, he lowered his hand after the oath and shook Joseph Weber's hand and said, "Welcome home." Weber tried to explain that he had been a German soldier. Meeks nodded. "I read your file. You were a prisoner at Camp White. You worked on farms during the war. You came back after. That makes you American." Weber did not know what to say. Meeks held his hand for another moment. "Welcome home, Mr. Weber." Weber walked out of the courthouse into the September's sunshine of Southern Oregon. Marta was waiting for him on the steps. Their daughters were with her. Ilse was 12 years old. Ursula was 10. They were both wearing new dresses. Weber walked down the steps and took his family in his arms and stood in front of the federal courthouse in Medford, Oregon, and understood that he had come home. Joseph Weber lived in Oregon until his death in 1998 at the age of 76. He never returned to Germany. Marta visited once in 1965 to see the remaining members of her family. Weber stayed home. He said, "Germany was the past. Oregon was the future." His pear orchard remained profitable through 4 decades of operation. It is still in operation today under the management of his grandson, whose name is also Joseph Weber. The concrete garage that Joseph the Elder helped build on Raymond Fisher's property in December 1944 is still standing. It is now used to store farm equipment by Fisher's great-grandson, who runs the same 340 acres of orchard that his great-great-grandfather homesteaded in 1889. The American flag flies over both properties. His daughters, when they were grown, asked him once why he had chosen to come back to America instead of staying in the country where he was born. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. He told them about the war, about Tunisia and the surrender, about the Liberty ship and the long voyage across the Atlantic, about expecting execution and receiving roast beef, about the Green Mountains and the farmer who spoke German and offered jobs to enemy soldiers, about the concrete garage that would last 50 years, about the apple pie and the newspaper subscriptions and the night classes in democracy. He told them about standing in Fisher's Orchard in the summer of 1945 and understanding for the first time what it meant to live in a place where government existed to serve people instead of people existing to serve government. He told them that Oregon was not heaven. He told them it was better than heaven. Heaven is something you reach after you die, he said. Oregon is something you can build while you are still alive. That is the story of Joseph Weber, of Stuttgart and Camp White and the Rogue Valley of Oregon. That is the story of more than 10,000 German prisoners of war who were sent to the state of Oregon between 1944 and 1946, and of the small number of them who came back after the war and built lives in the country that had treated them, when they were its enemies, better than their own country had treated them when they were its sons. Most Americans have never heard this story. It happened anyway.